Problem with always teaching in parables and symbols and metaphors is that it makes it hard for folks to tell when you wants to be taken literally. But for apologists, that ain't ambiguity, that's opportunity. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. Last time, Dr. Craig tried to convince us that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah using criteria of authenticity that he himself referred to as so-called criteria and put scare quotes around when he mentioned them. So he personally don't think these is valid criteria, but he uses them anyway because he thinks they can help him reach the conclusion he wants to reach. And if that ain't apologetics in a nutshell, I don't know what is. According to Dr. Craig, the Messiah was some kind of long-awaited prophesied hero who was supposed to come along and establish the kingdom of God here on earth and incidentally overthrow the Roman Empire that had soldiers occupying Palestine in the first century. And that makes a nice tidy little narrative, but the reality is that this particular speculation was only one of many legends and interpretations that was circulating in first century Palestine. When the very first Christians was looking for ways to declare that Jesus was something really special, they had a smorgasbord of options to choose from. And while that made it easy for them to come up with a compelling narrative, it makes it just that much harder to tell what, if anything, we can know about what Jesus himself actually claimed. Maybe he claimed to be the Messiah, maybe he just claimed to be a Messiah, or maybe he never mentioned messiahs at all. We ain't got no way to know. Well, a similar problem is waiting for Dr. Craig today as he tries to argue that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. And just to shake things up a bit, we're going to take his arguments slightly out of order. We're going to start with his conclusions, just like he did, and then work our way back to the arguments he thinks he can use to support them. Quote, on the basis of these three sayings of Jesus, we have good evidence that Jesus thought of himself as the unique Son of God. End quote. Or more precisely, we have good evidence that disciples who desperately wanted Jesus to be someone really special remembered him as thinking of himself as the unique Son of God. That's a point that Dr. Craig consistently glosses over, using criteria that he refers to as so-called criteria. But even Dr. Craig realizes that the term Son of God is ambiguous, especially in that culture. Quote, Jewish kings were referred to as God's sons, and in Jewish literature, a righteous man could be characterized as God's child, having God as his father. End quote. And that's true, but it goes even further than that. In 1 Thessalonians 5, Christians is referred to as sons of the light and sons of the day. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus gives James and John a name that means sons of thunder on account of their short tempers. In Acts 4, it says that the name Barnabas means son of encouragement, and so on. Son of could mean biologically descended from, but it was also used as an idiomatic expression of some particular quality that was a dominant feature of somebody's personality. So the phrase Son of God could just indicate a person who was especially holy or godly. Of course, none of that bothers Dr. Craig. Quote, still, given the uniqueness and exclusivity of Jesus' claim, such generic usage is really irrelevant. End quote. Except, of course, we ain't got any original claims by Jesus. We got stories told by disciples who was desperate to prove that Jesus weren't a failed Messiah, transmitted by word of mouth over decades, and selected by anonymous Greek-speaking writers about what Jesus supposedly claimed. And that means that the generic metaphorical usage is extremely relevant, since it's such a trivial step rhetorically to move from Son of God in the metaphorical sense to Son of God in the literal sense. To folks who had forsaken everything to follow Jesus, only to see him fail miserably, it would have been tremendously vindicating to have Jesus turn out to be a pre-existent spiritual being who was only temporarily mortal as part of some wise and ineffable design. But now, let's go back and talk about the supposed uniqueness and exclusivity of Jesus' claims that Dr. Craig refers to. Where's he getting that from? He gives us 3 examples, and the first is the parable of the vineyard in Mark chapter 12. The gist of it is that some rich guy owns a vineyard and he rents it out to some tenants who's supposed to do all the work in exchange for a share of the harvest. But when harvest time comes, the tenants decide to keep it all for themselves, and every time the owner sends servants to collect it, they beat the servants and send them home empty-handed. So the owner decides to send his son because they won't dare mess with his son. Or at least he assumes they won't, but as it turns out, he gets wrong. They kill the son so that they won't be nobody left to inherit the vineyard. And of course, at that point, finally, the owner wises up and sends armed men to take revenge on the tenants. And if he'd been smart enough to do that in the first place, his son would still be alive. And I think that's kind of ironic, considering that in this parable, the owner is supposed to represent God, who's supposed to be smarter than that. But anyways, the owner is God, the vineyard represents the nation of Israel, the tenants represent the priest, the servants who get beat up represents the prophets. But who does the son represent? Well, obviously, Dr. Craig wants us to think that the Son represents Jesus, and that this parable was a prediction by Jesus of his own death. Quote, even skeptical scholars recognize the authenticity of this parable, since it's also found in one of their favorite sources, the Gospel of Thomas, and so is, by their reckoning, independently confirmed. End quote. And how does Dr. Craig know that the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Thomas is independent sources? He don't. Nobody does. The author of Mark weren't there when Jesus supposedly told this parable. Neither was the author of the Gospel of Thomas. They both has to have gotten this story from some person or persons other than Jesus. And we ain't got no reason to believe that 2 entirely independent versions of this story was handed down by word of mouth in the church over multiple decades without ever influencing each other. How likely is it that this story is an early embellishment attempting to rationalize Jesus' death? Well, consider that, as Dr. Craig mentions, there's a passage in Isaiah chapter 5 that tells a parable about Israel being a vineyard and how God took such wonderful care of it, and yet it only produced bad grapes, and so God tears it down and plows it over and leaves it to rot. And that's pretty similar to the parable that Jesus supposedly told, with just a couple variations, namely adding in the priesthood to be the bad guys and adding in the prophets and the son to be the victims of the bad guys' violence. So put yourself in the place of the early disciples who was expecting Jesus to establish God's kingdom here on earth, only to have him die as a criminal. If you don't want to admit you was fooled by a false prophet, you's going to be looking for some way to turn his death into some kind of glorious spiritual victory. He's going to be looking for ways to, quote-unquote, remember that his death weren't an accident and that he was telling you all along he was going to die, only you just didn't understand what he meant at the time. And in that context, a parable about wicked priests executing the Son of God is going to have a huge and satisfying emotional impact. It's possible that Jesus might have told a similar parable that ended with the tenants beating the servants and the owner sending the troops to punish them for that, and if that had been the original parable, it would have been a fairly simple matter to extend the story by adding in the death of the Son. The vindication that early believers would have felt would have more than made up for the fact that in the extended parable, God looks kind of stupid for not sending in the troops sooner. Now, is this all just speculation on my part? Sure it is, but so's the story Dr. Craig is telling about Jesus having originally told the parable the way Mark's Gospel reports it. We ain't got no objective, verifiable data to go on here. On the other hand, my speculations is more consistent with what we see in the real world, especially when it comes to how believers react to being wrong. Head on over to Scarlett's channel sometime and watch some of her videos on the rapture that was supposed to happen in 2025 and how believers reacted when it didn't. It's amazing how creative they can be when it comes to thinking up new narratives to make things work out so that they weren't mistaken after all. And there ain't no reason to suppose that believers in the first century was any less imaginative when it comes to denying that they'd been bamboozled by a false prophet. So let's look at Dr. Craig's second example from Matthew 11:27, where Jesus supposedly says this, quote, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." End quote. Dr. Craig says that this quote comes from a source shared by Matthew and Luke, and therefore it's early, and therefore it's authentic. But no, gospel stories could arise decades after the crucifixion of Christ and still be what you might call early. He also tries to argue that the criterion of embarrassment applies here on account of Christians would be embarrassed by Jesus saying nobody knows the Son, as if one of the most common things in the Gospels weren't all about folks failing to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, including the disciples. Dr. Craig's second example suffers from the same problems as his first one. Not only is there no objective, verifiable evidence that Jesus himself actually said it, but the language of the quote is exactly the kind of embellishment that would vindicate believers who dedicated their lives to him and didn't want folks to think they'd been taken in by a grifter. And remember, none of Jesus' sermons was taken down by a court stenographer. Over and over again, the Gospels makes it clear that the disciples weren't expecting Jesus to die, or at least not anytime soon. So they didn't need to write it down, assuming they knew how to read and write in the first place, which a lot of them probably didn't. That means that all of the stories about what Jesus said and did was based on folks trying to remember years later what he said and did. And that's subject to a considerable amount of unconscious editing and rephrasing, depending on what you understood him to mean at the time. And that's especially true in the case of the disciples, who was in the process of reinterpreting everything he'd ever told them in light of the fact that he'd failed to establish the kingdom of God here on earth and had died a shameful death instead. Memory reconstruction is unreliable under the best of circumstances, but these folks was operating under extreme duress. And it ain't surprising at all that they'd, quote-unquote, remember stories that transform the crucifixion from a defeat into a glorious spiritual victory, with Jesus as some kind of divine predestined hero. Let's go on ahead and check out Dr. Craig's third example. And this is a quote from Mark chapter 13, verse 32. Quote, "But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." End quote. And once again, Dr. Craig invokes the criterion of embarrassment on the grounds that this verse denies that the Son is omniscient, which means he ain't God. And I think that tells us a lot about the reliability of the criterion of embarrassment, because this verse still contradicts the doctrine of the Trinity even today. And yet, Trinitarian Christians still believe that Jesus said it, which just goes to show that believers ain't afraid to hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time. And that makes the criterion of embarrassment an unreliable guide to what early Christians would or would not have made up. The conclusion that Dr. Craig draws from this verse is that Jesus is claiming to be God's unique Son, which is kind of strange considering there ain't nothing in the verse that talks about the Son being unique. All it says is that there's something the Son don't know, and that ain't the same thing at all. Dr. Craig is so excited about Jesus being quoted as saying something that the Nicene Council wouldn't have made up, he don't even notice that the quote don't say what he wants it to say. And what's ironic is that even his main point is a swing and a miss, because all it would take for this to be an early embellishment is for there to be Christians in the early church who weren't Trinitarians. which, considering that the doctrine of the Trinity weren't formalized until the early 4th century, that ain't going to be too hard. So the bottom line here is that Dr. Craig is leading us on an unabashed exercise in confirmation bias. He wants to be able to conclude that Jesus declared himself to be God the Son, second member of the Christian Trinity, and he's hunting through the 4 canonical Gospels looking for verses he can use to support his conclusions. And every passage he finds fails to support the conclusion he's trying to reach one way or another. All he's got is written records of viral stories that spread by word of mouth for decades among folks who, like Dr. Craig, was desperate to prove that Jesus weren't a false prophet. And even when he does find a passage that he thinks will work, it only works if you interpret it in a very particular way. There's no room here for the kind of nuance that theological discussions demand. Everything has to be cut and dried according to Dr. Craig's own preferred interpretation. There's no room for any consideration of the possibility that the quotes attributed to Jesus might have been metaphorical or metonymy or hyperbole or whatever. It has to mean only and exactly that Jesus was literally the only begotten Son of God. And that's a pretty fragile approach to understanding the Gospels if you really want an accurate understanding. The end result, after Dr. Craig has combed through all the stories handed down by desperate folks, is ambiguity. Quote, so we have here the same ambiguity with the title Son of God that we encountered in considering the title Messiah. These titles have many different meanings and are therefore ambiguous when taken out of context. End quote. And by context here, he don't mean literary context, as in looking at the words surrounding the text, because literary context ain't going to help him get to his goal. In order for context to eliminate the ambiguity here, he's going to have to manufacture it himself, and make sure to set it up in a way that has his preferred conclusion built in. But fortunately for him, that's the kind of thing that Apologist does best, and it sells well among believers because believers ain't looking for academic rigor and critical analysis. All they want is confirmation that their personal religious beliefs is true. And in that context, it's all too easy to eliminate ambiguity. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig's going to tackle one last title that he says Jesus claimed, namely the title Son of Man. And once you know it, he's going to have the exact same problems with that as he did with the other 2, and maybe even a new problem that really blows his case out of the water. So that should be fun. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.